My name's Frank Cox. I'm a former Professor of Physics and a former Provost of this college, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this series of lectures to commemorate the tercentenary of the new St Paul's Cathedral. And the new St Paul's Cathedral owes a lot to two Gresham professors, Robert Hooke and of course, the most important one of all, Sir Christopher Wren, who is interred still within that cathedral. So in order to start off this, we really ought to find out something about the way the cathedral was in fact built. And there's no better person to introduce this topic than our speaker tonight, Alan Chapman. Now, Alan is one of the 21st century polymaths. He was a 20th century polymath before this, in fact, which is, imagine. His main interest is in the history of science, particularly the history of instruments, and again, astronomy. He lectured here before many times at Gresham College and was a former visiting professor of this particular college, and his range of expertise goes from Flamsteed through to London hospitals to coffee shops. It's a very wide range indeed. And those of you who have heard Alan before, or heard him on the radio, or seen him on television will know that we're in for a very good evening. Now, I won't waste any more time and simply introduce him this evening. And his topic is the New London, Heavenly Jerusalem, and the specific title is Scientists and Craftsmen in Christopher Wren's London. Alan.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank, and also to thank you all for being here this evening. And may I say what an enormous honour I sense in being asked to speak on this subject, which is, after all, the 300th anniversary of the final topping out of St Paul's, which was half a century of building nearly, and to look at the world around it. And as it's rather warm, I hope you don't mind if I take my coat off. I thought it was at least appropriate and correct, and especially for St George's Day, to actually start with my jacket on. But if I now may take it off, thank you very much indeed. I'm not, of course, really going to say much about the architecture. That's not really strictly my area. And, of course, my very good friend, Professor Michael Cooper, is the real expert on the architecture of the period. What I want to look at is the wider cultural world. And what is the heavenly Jerusalem? What did they think they were doing? And the very fact that these two men most clearly involved with not only St Paul's, but the rebuilding of post-fire London, were both a pair of amateurs. Could you imagine it today if a major city was devastated in a 3-day-long event with a merciful, very small loss of life? It was thought that only 2 or 3 people actually died in the fire because it was at least slow enough that people would get away from it. But they would now appoint, let's say, a Cambridge astrophysicist and a professor of geometry to rebuild it. That is what they did in the 17th century. Neither man had served any kind of building training. They both came from what would be called the gentleman amateur architect's tradition. They both, of course, were cultivated, knowledgeable of architecture. They knew their Vitruvius's treatises, his 10 treatises on architecture, like the back of his hand, Roman building. And basically, in a sort of wing and a prayer and a good dash of mathematics, they put London together, and they built a cathedral which rivaled that of St. Peter's in Rome. And whilst not wanting to look in too much detail at the technology involved in the building, I want to say something about the wider cultural technology of that age. Now, first of all, Robert Hooke and his work with St Paul's straddles the old and the new, as I shall be coming to in a few moments. His very earliest works on St Paul's, purely scientific experiments where he used the vast size of medieval St Paul's, was, of course, in 1662-63, 5 years before the fire, 5 years before the great cathedral went down. And, of course, he is connected with the new one in various ways thereafter, not in a formal capacity, because, of course, Sir Christopher was doing it formally. But Robert Hooke became surveyor to the City of London. So one man, Sir Christopher Wren, was the architect to His Majesty King Charles II, in charge of all new buildings, most preeminently, of course, ecclesiastical ones, and to help to replace the 101 churches lost in the fire, including, of course, the National Cathedral. And then the other one, Robert Hooke, is responsible to the Mayor and Common Council of the city as city surveyor for putting the city back together. Can you imagine again a man who is a geometry professor being required to redesign a major capital city, and especially to put it in accordance with new fire regulations? I would suspect too that after the fire was the first time they realized that we have to do something about London so it's not going to go up again. And in many ways it survived until the Victorian age, until, of course, the great swathes of new chasms were cut into it to accommodate the railways for the great metropolitan railway stations in the, well, from the 1830s onwards. But first of all, what about the idea of redesigning a new Jerusalem? This has a lot to say about what England saw itself as in the 1660s. We had been through 18 years of extraordinary, traumatic and disturbing history. We'd had a civil war. We'd seen a monarch executed. We'd seen the so-called rule of the saints. And as I've suggested in my biography on Hooke, Hooke's distaste for Puritanism came, I suspect, not merely from the fact that his father was a high church Laudian clergyman on the Isle of Wight, but the fact that he was at Westminster School at the very time of the High Puritan Revolution, where literally from the school gates he would have seen the MPs going into St. Stephen's Chapel, of course where Parliament met in those days, to vote. He would have seen the saints, he would have seen Cromwell on horseback, and of course he may just have seen the execution of the king himself on the 30th of January 1649. We're told, of course, that Busby, the headmaster, made sure that all the boys were well locked in so they couldn't go and see it. But after all, he was only 200 yards up Whitehall. We do know that, however, his later friend Sam Pepys, the famous diarist, slunk off from St. Paul's to see it and left a vivid account of the execution. So that's the world we're talking of. It's a highly traumatized one. England had come through hellfire and fury and major national laceration by 1660, when the Royal Society was founded. And then, in 66, the city goes up. Between the 3rd and 5th of September, London burns fiercely. And there is a simple, massive, great, charred area from the Tower beyond to Ludgate Hill. And, of course, whether you could rebuild that or not, or whether you'd have to just desert it, and that was the end of the country, was even being debated at the time. What I think is indicative here is the immense vigour of the City of London. And as a historian of science, and particularly since the honour of being elected a Gresham Professor 5 years ago, I've become increasingly fascinated by the city, its wider cultural contributions, and the simple importance of wealth generation. Because, after all, science is not necessary. You can get along without science, at least to a certain level. If you don't mind dying at 35, and you don't mind having all your bones broken, you can live without science. After all, people live without it for millennia and millennia. But before you can actually start patronizing the necessary research out of which science comes, and which rarely ever has useful spin-off for at least a few decades, you have to be able to have what you might call the fat in the system to do it. You have to have the time, the leisure, the ingenuity, and the right social structures so that ingenious men, no women of course in those days, but ingenious men were able to do things which seemed outlandish, such as discover that the atmosphere has weight, discover that fleas have an anatomy as complicated as lions, to discover that there are 4 little moons going around Jupiter, and on and on and on. In anatomy, in astronomy, in medicine, in botany, in mechanics, in hydrostatics, and so on. And even at this early stage, there's a realization that there has to be a cross-fertilization of technologies. The air pump made by Hooke for Boyle in 1659 and first used in Oxford, first actually used, which discovered that air had weight and led to the heart of the discovery of the gas laws, would not have been possible but for vast technological improvements in gun-making. Because without the skill of boring accurate barrels, it would have been impossible to have made the cylinders of those air pumps. Likewise, of course, when Hooke is doing his crucial early experiment in the city on the nature of spring, and leading to the heart, of course, of his discovery of his famous law on the nature of spring, which is announced in the 1670s. That would have been impossible but for spare time and leisure. But then, of course, what does Hooke do? What does that whole community do? You find useful applications. you find that the equal tension in, out that you have when you wind up a spring, release a spring, wind up a spring, release a spring, can revolutionize timekeeping. And hence, of course, their friend Thomas Tompion starts manufacturing watches of a higher quality than ever before. Now, this, I think, is crucial. I think also, too, it's important to talk about this in Gresham, because Gresham, a century earlier, Sir Thomas Gresham, the founder of the Royal Exchange, the founding in many ways of the real clout of the City of London, the establishment of the Exchange, modelled, of course, on the Antwerp Bourse, the origins of the stock market, realised, of course, that it was all right just making and selling things. But if you could develop a more elaborate financial mechanism, such as servicing debts and dealing with credit and things of this sort, you could do bigger and bigger things. Especially, of course, too, as at the time, for about 500 yards along the north bank of the Thames were the wharfs into which every conceivable kind of commodity from the face of the earth came into London. Chinese silks, Mexican fruits, cotton, all sorts of stuff. And, of course, they came up in those days a series of little narrow winding lanes until you got into the city proper, where in those days, of course, most of the merchants had their houses. Most of the houses, of course, not being straightforward houses on the front, but rather like little courtyard houses with capacious cellars where the merchant would store his commodities ready for sale or resale. And, of course, we know from Hook and from Pepys and various others that there's this endless packing of traffic in these narrow little alleyways between places like Ludgate Hill and Cheapside down to the wharves of the river. And in other words, it's a bustling, busy city. It's why it burns down so easily in 1666. Much of it was medieval, much of it was made of timber, and of course even some of it was thatched. Now this, I think, gives some idea of what the city is like. But when the fire came and destroyed it, it required a colossal amount of rethinking about what one should redo. Now, right away, you have Robert Hooke and Christopher Wren, Dr. Wren, as he was in those days before he was knighted, submitting plans to the king for the redesigning of the city. They were suggesting more or less a city with variants, a gridiron kind of plan. And the redesign of a church called St. Paul, although we knew quite at this stage what it was going to look like, at the sort of the hub of a great wheel of radiating streets. This was to be the new model city. The hope was, of course, it would turn London into one of the great visual attractions of Europe. That didn't happen, and the reason was because London simply had the energy to rebuild itself right away. The monarchy could not rebuild London. King Charles II was stumbling from one major debt to another. Most of his aristocracy was broke, or at least they lived on loans to maintain appearance. The only people who had money in this country were merchants, country gentlemen, great farmers, and people like that, and they had a lot of it. And the one thing they weren't going to do was let their businesses stagnate for 25 years, whilst a pack of aesthetes redesigned London. They wanted to get their premises up and running as quickly as possible. And it is astonishing that within a decade, by the early 1670s, most of London is running again. And of course, Robert Hooke himself, as surveyor to the city, makes a substantial amount of money out of this because his office enabled him to license the rebuilding of plots where you could find where your business was or your house was and rebuild. Now, this becomes very important. But the central thing is, what do you do with St. Paul's? Well, at first, of course, the possibility was, can we use part of the old fabric? I have some slides I'll show in a moment of some sketches done of what was standing in 1667. There were original hopes that perhaps we could build another Gothic church, or we could even do a mixture of Gothic and classical. After all, in 1663, Wren had submitted plans for putting a dome on old St. Paul's. It would have looked spectacularly incongruous. The original medieval tower burned down in Queen Elizabeth's time. But in fact, these were ideas that were there. But then it came to be recognised that no, the walls are not strong enough. The massive heat damage of the fire has done so much damage to the structure. All you can do is flatten the site and start again. Now, I don't want to discuss all the different plans and the different models and the different suggestions that were brought forward for actually redesigning London. But by the time, let me just mention this, by the 1670s, that they had produced one that became the definitive model for St. Paul's, known as the Great Model. And, of course, this was a very, very large wooden building of the intended future St. Paul's, although, of course, there were still modifications went on in the building process. It was the size of a garage. You could more or less walk through it on all fours. And when in 1675, the authorization was given for the building of the Greenwich Observatory for John Flamsteed, the great model cost only a few pounds less than the entire Royal Observatory. So you can get some idea of what architects' fees and architects' charges were even at that day. Literally, a wooden model the size of a modern garage cost almost as much as the entire Royal Observatory. The Royal Observatory was £519 and some shillings. Now, this gives you some idea of what world they were working with, but what did you want in a cathedral? Now, this is, of course, where the idea of the heavenly Jerusalem comes in. There was a growing sense at this time of England as a Protestant country. There were great tensions with not only defunct Puritanism, but also to what was seen as the dangers of possible Catholicism. And, of course, the Duke of York, the man who would become James II, actually had converted to Roman Catholicism and causing great, great ructions in the country after 1667. Therefore, what sort of church would express what you would call the religious spirit of now a very, very Protestant England? And Wren has to take this on board when he's doing the general sketches, the general scans for what the new church must be. The fashion, of course, is going to be a great, magnificent, continental-style building. Obviously, of course, based on something like St. Peter's in Rome. The thing is, of course, that was a Roman Catholic church. The Anglican liturgy required very different internal arrangement. The Anglican liturgy from the Reformation, from Thomas Cranmer in the First Book of Common Prayer, required that the congregation see everything that was going on. You therefore need a church which is virtually like a football stadium inside, where you have the high altar, and you have the transepts, and you have all the spectacular architecture above, but where everything is completely visible. You can't have baldacchinos, you can't have great elaborate screens. And so the New Jerusalem had to be a very public, and in many ways an astonishingly egalitarian Jerusalem. Because very, very central to that idea too, which was rooted in Protestant theology, is the idea that the clergy were not themselves a sacerdotal priesthood, in the way that, of course, the Catholic clergy were a sacerdotal priesthood, and by the pipeline through Peter and straight back to Christ, but rather they were basically learned men who knew their theology, just like you and me. And therefore, what they were doing in the public space had to be accountable to their learning, yes, but not to any particular mystique beyond their learning. So you have a whole theological package that Wren has to take on board, and Wren knew all about this. Sir Christopher Wren was the son of a clergyman, Christopher Wren Sr. His father had been rector of East Noyle in Wiltshire. And then in 1635, when Christopher is a baby of 3, he becomes Dean of the Chapel Royal at Windsor. This would have meant, therefore, that young Christopher would have met King Charles I, he would have met his queen, he would have met all the courtiers. As a little boy, living in the deanery, he would have met all the great figures of state. So he knew all about what was needed by Protestantism. Also, too, he had an uncle, Matthew, who became Bishop of Ely, who suffered heavily under the Puritans and was actually endured 20 years in jail during the Puritan time. And so, therefore, Christopher Wren is not just an architect, he's not just a scientist. He doesn't just simply come to, well, this is the building you want and how to put it up. He understood all the theology that was required, that said what will be done in this space. And, of course, this was for a New Jerusalem. Protestantism saw itself as a New Jerusalem. And it's not for nothing that John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress comes rolling off the presses exactly at this time in the 1660s. Yes, it wasn't Anglican, it was Baptist, but nonetheless the idea of a New Jerusalem, the crossing the Jordan, the nation's rebirth, mankind's rebirth in Protestantism, that's the baggage, that's the whole mass of body of ideas they're playing with. So it's not just building a beautiful church that will make everybody's jaw drop. It is to combine the finest classicism with rock-solid Protestant theology. And that, of course, is at the very heart of this vision of a New Jerusalem. Now, Robert Hooke, where does he come from? And I want to really talk primarily about these two gentlemen this afternoon because they were lifelong friends, having met at Oxford in the 1650s, and friendship retaining with them until Hooke's death in 1703. Hooke came from a very similar kind of theological background, although his father was not as wealthy or as distinguished as that of Christopher Wren Sr. He was born at Freshwater on the Isle of Wight in 1635. He was 3 years younger than Wren. His father was perpetual curate of the parish, and you may wonder, how does he actually get all the connections to get to where he's going? Well, I think I can probably suggest a number of things which I've been able to find out through ecclesiastical records. When his father dies in 1648, John Hooke, the Reverend John Hooke, he's not badly off. The idea that he's a poor man is wrong. He lives several £100s and some good acreage on the Isle of Wight, so they're not poor. They're sort of minor gentry in that bracket. But the key thing is with him, how do you then get your son moving? 1648 was the time when the Second Civil War was beginning to end, when King Charles I was about to be tried and executed in January 49, and Mr. Hooke dies in October 48, at one of the most turbulent constitutional times in British history. We have a king going on trial, and almost certainly they'll execute him. Now that is pretty radical. He dies. Some reason or other, Robert Hooke ends up in London. The other thing is, how does he do this? Well, the rector, the man who actually owned the advowson of Freshwater at that time, is the Reverend Cardell Goodman. The Reverend Cardell Goodman is mentioned several times by Hooke in his later life as his father's friend and patron. Cardell Goodman had been at Westminster. He'd been at Christ Church in Oxford. And who had been Cardell Goodman's predecessor on the Isle of Wight at Freshwater? The Reverend Dr. Samuel Fell. The Reverend Dr. Samuel Fell, ex-Westminster, and now Dean of Christ Church. And I think you had a sort of high church Laudian, what you might call underground railway, in these troubled Puritan times, saying, well, Mr. Hooke's dead, he's got a very, very bright lad, we don't want the Puritans to get their mitts on him, let's secret him off to Busby at Westminster, who was doing a wonderful balancing act in just pleasing everybody at that time. Then after that, get him to Christ Church, which is exactly the route he follows. Now, I think it's this connection between Freshwater, Westminster, and Oxford that, as it were, provides the road that Robert Hooke's career goes on. Once he's there, of course, his career takes off. Now, what would be the status of architecture in a gentleman's education at that time? If you'd have been at Oxford at that time, or at Cambridge, or at any other significant European university, you would have understood a body of ideas called the quadrivium. These would have been 4 mathematically related disciplines. They would have included astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music. And of course, they resonate in some of the Gresham chairs. It was not for nothing, of course, that Sir Thomas Gresham wanted these to be taught in Gresham College. The key thing is, of course, they were the sciences of proportion. The sciences of what they called ratione, reason, scholarly reason. And part of that study was the visible manifestation of geometry, architectura. It's hardly unlikely, therefore, that the study of architecture was often part of a gentleman's secondary education. It was a well-established practice. Sir Thomas Spratt, an English architect of that time, Sir Roger Pratt, of exactly this time, designs buildings and writes. Also, too, you have a number of people like Inigo Jones working in the classical tradition in England, trying to bring in the classical tradition from Italy and somehow absorb it with the existing earlier Gothic tradition. So the idea, therefore, of a gentleman being fascinated by building doesn't mean necessarily that Hooke could necessarily put a brick upon a brick, but he could understand the proportions, the mathematics, the whole vocabulary of architecture, which, of course, he would have got from Pollio Vitruvius, about 40 AD's Architectura in Decem Libre, architecture in 10 books, available in Latin and easily understandable to somebody like Hooke and Wren. This is how you get 2 amateurs redesigning London. Now, what kind of things were they doing scientifically? Because I want you to look at Hooke and Wren as scientific figures. Well, the one central thing is that astronomy, mechanics, and all the arts of optics and horology were undergoing rapid changes at this time. And how do these click in to the nature of St. Paul's? Well, I would say the significant thing with Hooke at first is not the St. Paul's we all know and love. It was its predecessor that burned down. In 1662, when he's one of the early fellows, or still not at this stage a full fellow of the Royal Society, but he's attending Royal Society meetings shortly before he's elected to the curatorship of experiments and to fellowship in 1663. He is conducting a series of experiments inspired by Sir Francis Bacon, his treatise Novum Organum, 1620. And these were about gravity. Of course, we all believe that Isaac Newton discovered gravity. Newton, of course, in Principia, discovers the laws that gravity obey. But the idea of gravity was a concept in general usage and widely spoken of amongst physicists, astronomers, and mechanics of that day. Simply gravitas, the Latin word for being heavy. How does heaviness change? Why do things fall? Why do they roll? And so on. Galileo, of course, in his treatise on the new sciences in 1630, does a major study there. But the question is, does gravity get weaker with distance? And Hooke wants to determine this, because Hooke wants to find out if, for instance, you are further and further away from the sun, is this the reason why the planets go more slowly? Is the reason why that Mercury, for instance, goes around the sun in 88 days and Jupiter takes 12 years have anything to do with their distances from the sun, that somehow this force is getting weaker in a mathematical relationship? Now, Hooke is a consummate experimentalist. How do you determine this? He sets up an experiment in the high roof vaults of Old St. Paul's, where he says he had a 90-foot dead drop. He set up a fine balance, a fine apothecary's balance, as it were, if this is the ledge, overhanging the ledge with a 90-foot drop down there. He has 2 3-pound iron weights, and they're weighed exactly at ground level. Similarly with pieces of string. He then takes them up there and has a device for holding them over. One weight is kept round up in the pan, the other one is allowed to fall gently till it almost touches the cathedral floor. He wants to find if 3 pounds is going to weigh heavier 90 feet closer to the centre of the earth than up in the air. Now that's brilliant, inspired thinkings in terms of physics experimentation. He actually finds that it's a bit heavier. But he's a good enough scientist to say this. First of all, the air of London is damp, and the string might have absorbed moisture, which therefore would tip the balance a bit more. Likewise, too, in the vast space of the cathedral, it's quite likely that moving air currents would have just played on the string. But nonetheless, he thought that there was a mathematical relationship even over 90 feet. During 1665, during the year of the Great Plague, when the Royal Society left London and went to reside, in fact, at a great house called Durden's just on the Suffolk Downs, he then found a 360-foot deep well. And he repeated the experiment underground. In other words, if you drop the weight below the ground, is it going to be the same as if you drop it in a great church above the ground? He came to the same conclusion, but realized, of course, that inside a well, there's so much air movement, you couldn't be sure. But that shows you where the experimental mentality is coming from. Now, what you get in this man who is designing London is a fascination for the mechanical, mathematical laws that hold nature together. Wren shares them entirely, and let us not forget, both were Gresham professors. In 1657, Dr. Wren was elected to the chair of astronomy, which he held for 7 years before becoming the frankly better paid professor, civilian professor of astronomy at Oxford, a post he held until his greatness, as it were, and his building of London really did not give him the time to lecture. In 1665, Robert Hooke was appointed to the companion chair of geometry. Notice, of course, astronomy and geometry, the two elements of the quadrivium, the celestial and the demonstrative in mathematics. And I find it fascinating to see how these things intermix and run completely together. Now, what kind of science was Wren doing? Because we think, of course, of Sir Christopher Wren as an architect. But really, his architecture came on a sort of early amateur basis, just like that of Robert Hooke. And we don't know what they swapped amongst each other in the early days before Hooke was keeping his diary and no letters survive in the 1660s. But as these two men had met at Oxford, as protégés of Dr. Wilkins at my college, at Wadham College, we just don't know what they had said to each other, but certainly an established lifelong friendship was already there. Wren, though, is very concerned with optics. He was particularly interested in trying to improve the telescope, and after 1649, started to do experiments trying to resolve the nature of Saturn. Now, bearing in mind, 1649, he's still only a teenager. He's still only 17 when he's doing this. And he's working on the idea that why does Saturn change shape? Why at certain types of its orbit does Saturn appear as a sphere? And why at certain times rather like a rugby ball, as they thought it looked in the rather poor images of the day? Why does it change shape? Galileo had first noticed this 30 years before. And of course, Galileo had announced this in a famous anagram to learned Europe in Latin, which was eventually cracked, and states this: Saturn hath devoured his children. What exactly does that mean? Well, if you read Hesiod's Theogony, about 700 BC, the origins of the Greek gods, probably the first book to write what you would call theology, to examine what they thought their gods and goddesses were, by Hesiod, who was a Greek of 700 odd BC. You get the story of all the gods, where most of the Greek myths come from. And Saturn is the old mad god who devours his sons alive. So therefore, and also too, I may say, if you visit the, I think it's the Prado in Madrid, this great Goya painting of that very, very fact, it hits you as you go in, this lunatic god with a grey beard eating a man. And of course, when Galileo therefore announces this idea that Saturn hath devoured his children, it would have been instantly recognizable as a parallel in learned Europe. Why is Saturn gobbling something up and regurgitating it? The question is what? Wren tries to make some models of Saturn. And we know he has what he calls pasteboard, where he tries to make various things around a sphere and changing shapes as a way of looking at particular light, where he knew, of course, he would be modeling it in sunlight so that the sun will be coming at the same angle that Saturn will be getting it in the sky, and trying to work it out. Of course, the problem was eventually solved in 1655 by Christian Huygens in The Hague, probably simply because of better telescope technology. Glasses that could finally show what Huygens realizes was that, quote, Saturn was a ball surrounded by a thin, flat ring that on no places touches the body of the planet. But nonetheless, it appears to tilt open and shut. When Saturn has devoured his children, we see the rings edge on, hence we don't see them at all. And of course, when Saturn has his children, you see the rugby ball shape, these sort of things stuck on the side of Saturn. Now, this is where he's coming from. But also, too, Wren is a consummate mathematician. And another thing was greatly fascinating them as well, the shape of geometrical curves. Hooke shared this fascination as well, particularly the mathematics of what they called the cycloid. Now, the cycloid is a particular, beautiful, elegant mathematical shape. They wanted to know how it was actually produced, what its mathematical properties were, and they immediately recognized as well that it would be important for clockmakers, because the curves of cycloids were so elegant that if you made teeth with cycloidal curves, they would mesh perfectly and never jam and just slide off each other. So you don't only analyze a problem in abstract geometry, you think, how can I apply it to horology as well? And this way of thinking is deeply there. Now, Wren would have lectured on these things to Gresham. These would have been the things he gave in the audiences where people could have walked in. Bishopsgate, of course, in those days is where the college was, where you could have walked in and seen these lectures and heard these lectures. It says something, too, about the composition of the London population. In the same way that today, I'm sure there are many people of diverse backgrounds here. And especially, of course, when you have Lincoln's Inn Fields down the corner, you probably would have had lawyers dropping in and things of this sort. And the extraordinary active world that the Gresham lectures would have generated, both, of course, with Wren and then later with Hooke after 1665, gives you a sense of these two men designing a city and lecturing on mathematics at the same time. And this is, I think, an extraordinary combination. But also, too, what about the ideas of clocks and springs? This is central to their ways of thinking. Hooke is trying to improve a timekeeper which will actually be isochronous. And their inspiration was the swinging of a pendulum. Now, Galileo had discovered that the swinging of a pendulum was equal, or isochronous, for a given length. And he discovered the fact in about 1630. Then Christian Huygens, again in The Hague, employs Solomon Coster a Dutch clockmaker, to work out a mechanism by where this pendulum could be attached to a piece of clockwork. This revolutionizes horology. And the idea was that instead of just simply having a spring or a weight that was turning a body of wheels and having a fairly crude escapement as they had before, that you would sort of rock, clack, 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 like that, and eventually you had metal bouncing off metal, which of course can vary depending on temperature and humidity and things of this sort. If you now have a physics principle controlling it, isochronism, then you can revolutionize timekeeping. Now, this itself not only fascinates Hooke, but also takes him into realms of physics experimentation, which again returns him to St. Paul's, old St. Paul's. What he wants to know is, how long can you make pendulums and determine their swing? Well, of course, from the very top of the tower, if you went up there, you had about 200 feet above London. And he found there you could have a drop of about 50 feet, about 100 feet to the leads of the cathedral. He experiments with very long pendulums. But then too, he experiments with what he calls conical pendulums. And these are particularly curious. Now, if you take a piece of string, and this was first discovered by Jeremiah Horrocks 30 years before, about 1638, and you have a piece of string, and you have anything tied on the end of it that's fairly heavy to give it some tension, and you just throw it, it won't do that. It will describe not a circle, but an ellipse. And then the ellipse will, as it were, if you start it off doing that, it will then precess like that, totally on its own. Why does the pendulum do this? And why, if you want it to keep time in a clock, do you have to put what were called cycloidal cheeks to just keep it going in one direction? Now, what they're asking in terms of physics, is this caused by the Earth's rotation? Is it caused by literally the Earth is moving beneath us? And also, too, is the Earth's pull on the bob of the pendulum analogous to the pull of the sun on the planets, and hence generating automatically an elliptical motion? Now, Hooke, of course, and Wren, the consummate experimentalists, played around with conical pendula to see if they could simulate the properties of the planetary periods. And itself a brilliant idea. They weren't quite right. But then, of course, what they were asking as well is, if you have big spaces like old St. Paul's, then, of course, you have very nice places to do your experiments. And especially, of course, if you are in good connection with them. And, of course, too, Sheldon, Bishop of London, and, of course, Wren's first major patron for the building of the Sheldonian Theatre in London, in Oxford. If the Bishop of London is your friend, you can do all kinds of things inside the cathedral, especially, of course, if your dad happens to have been the Dean of the Chapel Royal. So you can see how ecclesiastical space almost becomes laboratory space, even within this context of the New Jerusalem. Their faith and their science melded completely together. And the popular image that we often have, that their religious and their scientific beliefs were in some kind of opposition, is frankly 20th century rewriting. You find this in none of their original writings, where they assume that the logic and order in the universe is divine and can be pursued and studied by the human intellect. But then also, too, Hooke starts to go further with gravity. Can you actually determine whether the Earth is rotating? And he does this in an experiment in Gresham College. And he tells us that in the old hall of the college, the top of the rafters were 27 feet above the floor. And he sets up a mechanism by which a musket or a pistol ball could be released by pulling a string and dropped into a tub of pipe clay. Before you did the experiment, you had a piece of string going all the way down until it almost touched the top of pipe clay. Then you put a little black mark on the top of the pipe clay, kept everything as it was, and then let the ball fall. Hooke's argument was the ball should not fall on the black mark, because if it's in free fall, the Earth will have moved between it being released and hitting the pipe clay. He claimed he got some worthwhile figures in this. But again, he was a good enough scientist to say, well, there are all sorts of factors, there are drafts, but you can see the style of thinking. This is front rank, cutting edge experimental physics. And it's very different from the kind of thinking of Sir Isaac Newton, whose approach is essentially a mathematical one of mathematical analysis, rather than using physical analogues and then going from them beyond it. Now, these are the men who build the New Jerusalem. Now, also, too, there's another wonderful thing where their physics and their architecture run together. And this is in the nature of catenary arches. Now, Robert Hooke discusses catenary arches in his diary in the 1670s and in a variety of other places. And it's again an analysis of geometrical shapes. Now, a catenary arch is absolutely a simple thing to understand. You have 2 points, you drape something between the 2 points, a chain, a rope, a piece of string, whatever it is, and it will form a curve. And it will depend on the length of the material, the tension put upon it, and so on. And you can have an arch that's like that, or you can have an arch that's like that, and so on. What they come to explore are the ways in that catenary arch actually takes load-bearing powers. And this is important for architecture. If you are gradually, as Sir Christopher was, groping your ideas to a not quite fully understood notion of how I am going to put a dome on that very, very large church at the end of Ludgate Hill, and haven't quite cracked it yet, a knowledge of catenary arches is very important. It suggests something about how you at first think of the pillars, how you actually think of the outward thrust of the dome, and it's not for nothing that in Hooke's diary are some of the first discussions and little sketches of these catenaries. Now, both Wren and Hooke came from an applied physics tradition in architecture. Wren's great triumph, his first great triumph, the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, was itself a great intellectual puzzle. And how did you take the Temple of Marcellus, which of course is a classical Roman building, how did you take that, adapt it to an English climate, by definition requiring very large windows, and requiring a roof, where, of course, obviously in Italy you have no windows and you have no roof. How do you adapt that to a structure where you can also put the university printing press above the ceremonial area? You need an ingenious floor. He discusses the mechanics of floors. John Wallis in Oxford designs an extraordinary interlacing sort of almost kind of small piece floor where every joint connects and you literally cover the area with a spectacular, very flexible floor. This is the kind of area that these men are coming from. They're not only classical, they're deeply scientific in their designing. And by the time, of course, they're designing St. Paul's, and Hooke, of course, is in regular connection on the design of St. Paul's, you're actually now having to very, very astute scientific minds addressing these questions. Now, how closely did they work? Well, between 1672 and 1680, Robert Hooke kept a detailed daily diary. Sometimes his comments for the day were very, very brief. Others, they were very long. In fact, the first day of 1675, January 1st, 1675, it's the longest entry in the entire diary. It's about 2 printed pages long in the published version. But the key thing is that comes through that diary is if there is one figure who has an almost daily appearance in Hooke's life, it is the person he refers to as Sir Christopher Wren, in his usual quick abbreviations, or Sir Christopher, or things of this, or at first Dr. Wren. What is clear is that they had a lot of social connection. You also too see not merely the two architects working, and talking about churches, for instance, trying to determine whether the footings for the new Bow steeple in St. Marylebone Bow were strong enough to take it, and things of this. All of these sort of little bits and bobs going in. But they also knew were on very, very good terms with the senior clergy. And we have to bear in mind, too, that the architects and the clients worked closely together, not only, of course, with the dean and chapter of the cathedral, and even the bishop himself, but also, too, the Lord Mayor and the Common Council for Hooke. Now, Hooke's diary is full of this, and you can reconstruct what he and to some degree Wren are doing on a daily basis. They're dealing with contractors, they're dealing with the very practical business of making sure that materials, the right firms are brought in, people who know what they're doing, and also too, dining, drinking coffee and visiting taverns with fellows of the Royal Society who are senior clergy at the same time. Now, this is another thing which comes up with St. Paul's, the who's who in the cathedral at that time. Now, the man, of course, who was the most influential figure in Hook's life, I think, connected with the cathedral, was, of course, John Tillotson, the Reverend Dr. John Tillotson. Later becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. He is one of the spectacular careerists of the immediate Caroline period. He is of strong Puritan background, but he moves away from that at the Restoration. He becomes Dean of Canterbury. He then becomes Dean of St. Paul's. He accumulates a variety of canonries and prebendaries all over the place. And for the last 3 years of his life, he's Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, what sort of a man is Tillotson? Well, first of all, a close friend of Hook's. And I think I can say I've pieced together certain elements of the relationship. And this comes from Mrs. Tillotson, Elizabeth. Who is Elizabeth Tillotson? She is the wife of Dr. French of Christ Church in Oxford. But who is her mother? Robina, relict of Canon French of Christ Church, and the youngest sister to Oliver Cromwell. Well, well, well. So you have the youngest sister of Oliver Cromwell. What does she do? She makes a strategic political marriage with John Wilkins, Warden of Wadham. Wilkins would have become, as it were, the protector of the young Elizabeth. Wilkins, of course, has his whole circle of men around him, Hook part of them. And there's no sign of romance between Hook and her. There's nothing remotely like that. I don't think Hook really ever intended to marry anybody. But the key thing, he knew her. And also, too, Tillotson becomes one of the clerical protégés of Dr. Wilkins. And Wilkins, in the newly established Anglican hierarchy, helps him along to his first little deanery, which, of course, is Canterbury. Now, he then marries Wilkins's ward. And so you see this connection, the switch from the Cromwell family into the See of Canterbury. And, of course, what's the connecting factor? Robert Hooke. He's there at every stage. Now, sometimes when you're reading Hooke's diary, there's a slight risk of confusing people, because, in fact, Hooke traditionally used the business of reciting a person's title rather than names. So it will be Mr. Dean of Canterbury, Mr. Dean of St. Paul's, my Lord Archbishop. They're all the same man, as various incarnations along the way. And then likewise, too, Elizabeth will be Mrs. Dean of St. Paul's or Mrs. Dean of Canterbury. But also we discover another thing about Elizabeth. She was interested in medicine. And Robert Hooke, of course, too, was a lifelong hypochondriac and a lifelong doser of himself with all kinds of empiric preparations. Mrs. St. Paul's brewed an excellent ale physic, which, according to Hooke, did him wonders and brought much slime up off my stomach. Clearly highly purgative. So the way you suddenly enter this world is extraordinary. Bearing in mind, too, that in the early days of the Royal Society, Tillotson becomes an FRS. He's interested in natural philosophy. He's interested in science. So the Dean of St. Paul's is an FRS, and later the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I may say, too, that in 1691, when Tillotson became Archbishop, one of the first things he did was confer a Lambeth MD on Robert Hooke. This extraordinary connection. Friend for 30 years. I'm now Archbishop. You're getting a Lambeth MD. And you can see that patronage mechanism working. But also, too, what about the school? Thomas Gale. Thomas Gale was High Master of the school, St. Paul's School, and himself a prebend of the cathedral, of the old, or no, of the new cathedral. At the time, of course, when it would have been virtually building, he was prebend of a building site, effectively. But, of course, they would have had the chancel that was still fit for liturgical purposes finished first. But also, too, he was an FRS. And I know this because I actually checked the fact this morning by ringing up the Royal Society. And I said, well, Dr. Thomas Gale, can you confirm that Dr. Thomas Gale was a fellow of the Royal Society? Yes, elected 1668. So you've got the Dean and the head of the school, both FRSs, and attending Royal Society meetings. So this I find is quite a fascinating connection to make. But then, who was passing through that school at that time? Now, St. Paul's was always very much a city school. It, on the whole, didn't take boarders in those days. It took boys from the city, from, on the whole, the mercantile families of the city. Born in 1656 is Edmund Halley, before the fire. He went to St. Paul's. He went up to Queen's Oxford in 1673 with, as he reminds us, a better set of astronomical instruments than those owned by the civilian professor. He had a rich dad. But he would have been tutored by Gale. Gale would have been High Master when he was a boy in the school. Now, a figure who then carries on the astronomical tradition from St. Paul's into the 18th century, and of course, too, bearing in mind Halley dies in 1742 at the age of 86, you can see how this remarkable tradition moves of engineering, experimental science, theology, mechanics, and of course all part of what they saw as the New Jerusalem. This is what I think is so fascinating about this period. There are aspects of it, unfortunately, which I think need a lot further explanation, and it certainly goes against many of the more popular interpretations of the Royal Society as an organisation which more or less came out of a purely scientific intent. You cannot understand the early Royal Society without also understanding its visionary agendas as well. You can't understand Bacon without understanding those visionary agendas, and Bacon is a deeply, deeply visionary person. So therefore, when one looks at Hooke and Wren and Gale and Tillotson and even Halley, you see the basis of a remarkable community. But then just finally, there were a number of figures who were part of their social circle who were craftsmen. Thomas Tompion, the man who developed the first proper balance spring watches under Hooke's direction, was a common figure mentioning in the diary all over the place. Tompion, of course, had premises in Water Lane, just off Fleet Street, past Ludgate Hill. He himself was part of this world of coffee drinkers, diners, and talkers. So too were Richard Reeves and Kit Cox, Christopher Cox, lens makers and telescope makers of Longacre, slightly further away. And you read the diaries, and you find accounts of where some of these men are mixing together in an extraordinary free way. Oxbridge-educated academics, deans, working clockmakers, and what they all shared in common was a passion for mechanics and the new philosophy and the rebuilding of London. This, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, is what I see as the vision of the New Jerusalem. And you might say it's a mixture of Bunyan, it's a mixture of Bacon, and it's a mixture of the early philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. But that's the culture, if you want to understand it. Could I now just show my slides, please? And this, of course, is Old St. Paul's, with the frontage, of course, the classical frontage, which I think was Inigo Jones, and of course the intention was originally for Wren to put a dome on top of that. And of course you can see with the tremendous height of that building how Hooke would have had his clear 90-foot drop inside. And the remnants of that cathedral shortly after the fire. They realised, of course, that was impossible to completely rebuild that. But from this here, from the figures in the foreground, you get some idea of how vastly high the internal arches were. And of course, this is Wren's drawing of a proposed new London, with, of course, the great radiating mass of streets from one of his possible sketches for St. Paul's. The Sheldonian, Wren's first great architectural triumph, punched through with gigantic windows, tiered seating, and a roof. And I must admit, about 2 years ago, I was interviewed for a television programme by a person doing something on English architecture. And this gentleman, in a rather snooty voice, said, well, of course, Wren was really a very naive, simplistic architect in many ways, wasn't he? And I said, well, when you look at this, it's one of the great engineering triumphs of the day. How do you roof a Roman amphitheatre, adapt it to the dark light of an English winter, when, of course, most of the ceremonial was taking place? How do you then accommodate a heavy industrial complex just behind the balustrade? How do you call that naive? To which he didn't have a response. This is part of Wren's drawings of the interior, the holding up of the roof. And, of course, those king posts in the middle of the roof will be easily as high as from here, almost up to the windows. You're in a big space. That's where the early university press was. And here is an early form of experimentation on catenary arches. This is from Trinity College Library, Cambridge. When, of course, Wren was doing Trinity College Library, all from here, I don't know whether that actually has a light, no, all from here would be below ground. But of course, how do you take this tremendous weight, but you do it by building a great subterranean set of curves. So the downward thrust is not just dispersed, it goes through, as it were, a great ellipsoid. That was a brilliant piece of architectural geometry. And of course, if you look at Trinity College Library, if you ask the porters nicely, they might give you a shovel, and you can dig up, and you can actually find the arches for yourselves. This is, of course, part of the final solved solution of how to put the dome on St. Paul's. You have, of course, in the lower part, the false dome, the one that you see, and then the great truncated cone in brick above it. And that truncated cone, a bit like a policeman's helmet, as it were, was then used as the base of a great wooden structure that kept up the dome proper. That was itself a brilliant piece of engineering. And, of course, another drawing of a similar picture. And, of course, the famous south front, the south transept, and the dome itself. And this is Canaletto's painting. This will be about 1760, something like that, of the frontage. Virtually unchanged as we find it today. Another Canaletto from the Inns of Court Gardens, showing, of course, in the days, of course, before skyscrapers, how St. Paul's utterly dominated the horizon. I have at home an early Victorian print of St. Paul's from Southwark, and it just literally escalates into the sky. Unlike today, where, of course, it's buried between all sorts of modern buildings. And, of course, this is I think it's the Rubilak bust of Christopher Wren. And this is Rita Greer's wonderful reconstruction of Hook from very detailed descriptions of his face. The popular image of Hook as some kind of hunchback or things of this sort comes entirely out of modern, what I call socio-babble literature. It has nothing to do with the historical record. And what, in fact, Rita Greer did with this was to take the two descriptions by John Aubrey and Richard Waller, two men who knew him very well, and do a sort of police identikit structure of the face. We know he was a snazzy dresser. He tells us the amount of money he spent on fine brocade cloth, the nice things he had. And, of course, she dresses him as a gentleman at the age of about 45 in the correct clothes for about 1680. And I suspect that that's probably not too far from what he looked like. Gresham College, of course, the original foundation of where, of course, this place itself came from in Bishopsgate. And, of course, Hook's microscope and various other apparatus as well. Why I put this in is it because it relates directly to Hook's fascination and Wren's fascination with the architecture of nature, how the world works, how all the bits go. And the one thing which to us we probably lost because of a sense of wonder, they found that when you look through the telescope, you had a sense of the magnificence and the awe and the vastness of the universe that was telescopic. But then when you look through the microscope, you found structures in flies, in insects, in crystals that were just as perfect. And this suggested to them simply the creator's designing hand. If there is such logic through the entire structure of nature, this was itself of wonder. And there are the idea of architecture of bricks and mortar comes from philosophical architecture of studying what they called the divine plan. Now, of course, this itself, you could almost think that was an aeroplane. This is Hook's drawing of the blue fly. He does extraordinary experiments with the blue fly to try to even determine the rate in which it beat its wings by calculating the buzz from a table of chords and coming to the idea that in 1 second, that the note G required 262 vibrations a second from the buzz of the fly. So you go from there to even acoustic theory. And here's his sketch of one of his great telescopes. I think this is his 36-foot in the old quad at Gresham College. And here's his drawing of the moon. Now, his drawing of the moon is on the left. And some years ago, I got a friend who owns quite a substantial private observatory to photograph that crater. It's called the crater Hipparchus, at exactly the same stage as illumination. Now, if you consider the size of that crater, if you take the top of the drawing to the bottom of the drawing, it is 90 arc seconds. Now, you can therefore compare from the modern photograph the quality of the detail. I reckon that Hooke's telescopes could show him details of about 2 or 3 arc seconds on the lunar surface. Now, this tells us something about the available technology. This is, of course, Bedlam Hospital, perhaps his greatest single building, sadly, of course, knocked down in the early part of the 19th century. 500-foot facade. These are the rather macabre statues that were over it. The 2 statues representing melancholy mania and raving mania, the 2 classes of mental illness in those days. And raving mania, of course, you can see on the right with his chains. Melancholy mania just looks very, very unhappy. And it must have been rather disconcerting for a person being admitted to the hospital to pass underneath what came to be nicknamed in Cockney slang, the Crazy Brothers. And of course, this is the Rake's Progress, which is Hogarth, of some 40 years after it was built, showing you the interior of that place, what was intended to be a model mental hospital. Now, of course, it's become so crowded, it's become, well, immortalized, of course, in Hogarth. But that was Hooke's mental hospital. And the only surviving building, Willen Church in Buckinghamshire, now part of Greater Milton Keynes, a lovely little church. And rather curiously, it comes 4 square to his education. He was educated at Westminster, and Busby became the patron of the living. And he decided he would give the living a new church, and he asked his old pupil to design it for him. So this is his only surviving building. And of course, Thomas Tompion, the great clockmaker. Now, I mentioned that you had Tompion and these people all coming together in very, very convivial sessions. You may think in perhaps more certain types of thinking, well, you wouldn't have clockmakers mixing with bishops, would you? No, it doesn't work like that. It was a much more open world. Now, when you look at him, if you didn't know he was a clockmaker, you could think he was a member of parliament or a bishop, something like that. And these people didn't go around in rags grunting. And when you collect the pictures, and I made a particular study of 18th century London craftsmen, particularly ones in the clock trades and things of this sort, and you look at, let's say, his successor, George Graham could have been a banker. And you find a confidence and an elegance. They moved in that society without any problem. And we have to bear in mind that when we try to understand it, we have to cut away a great deal of 19th and particularly 20th century, what I call psychobabble social theory, about class divisions and things of this sort. It was an amazingly open society if you've got something to contribute. And I think that's my last one. And is it possible to take any questions at all? I realize okay. Barbara has suggested if I took the questions individually afterwards. Is that all right? But anybody wants to ask me, I would gladly take them. Thank you. Sorry?
So I'm handing it over to my colleague.
Thank you.
Thank you for a really insightful, fascinating lecture. I was riveted to the spot down here. And, I mean, I really hadn't understood the complexity of the sort of life and the culture that surrounded Wren, and particularly the practicality of the thinking as well. And this amazing interwoven culture with so many people involved. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to...
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.